This is all theater. This is all just political theater.
Political theater. Political theater.
Pure political
Theater.
Theater.
Political theater.
The
nefarious,
Significant and protracted
political
theater for political theater's sake.
I yield back.
From Washington, this is Political Theater, Roll Call's review of the spectacle of politics on Capitol Hill and across the country. I'm Jason Dick. Hello and welcome back to Political Theater. This will be the last podcast we do before Election Day, and I realize that Election Day is every day now because almost all states are voting early in some form or another. There are literally tens of millions of votes that have already been cast and are being tabulated across the country for a variety of races, from president all the way down to dog catcher. But they have to turn off the spigot at some point, and that is Election Day. We'll be covering that, of course, and we'll have a podcast that follows. But for going into Election Day, I wanted to discuss with my colleagues, Danielas Altamari and Mary Ellen McIntyre, the Most Vulnerable Incumbents list that Roll Call publishes. We published our most recent and also final one before the election earlier this week in Roll Call. You can find that at rollcall.com. Or if you're a print subscriber, and I'm holding this up for those of you who are not watching this on YouTube, the most recent Roll Call edition has both Most Vulnerable Incumbent Senators, Most Vulnerable Incumbent House Members. We're going to talk about that franchise and how we, came to the decisions, how the list has evolved, what the list captures and what it doesn't capture, and some of the behind-the-scenes stuff. But first, I think that we should just note that Mary Ellen is on the road. Danielas has been on the road most recently to Omaha and Des Moines and so forth, reporting on the Senate races in Nebraska and the House race in the Omaha district, and then two of the House races in Iowa. She is back in the DMV area now, but Mary Ellen is now on the road, and it looks like she's on the road in somewhere delicious. So Mel,
Indeed.
Please tell us where you're at. Where in the world is Mary Ellen McIntyre, and what's she having for lunch?
I am in Flint, Michigan. For lunch, I am having a sandwich that includes both pork and brisket and like a blackberry barbecue sauce. So I'm going to go finish that as soon as we're done. But we're here because Hakeem Jeffries is campaigning here today with some of the Democratic candidates for House races. We were with him this morning in Lansing, along with Curtis Hertel, the Democrat who's running to replace Alyssa Slotkin. And this afternoon, he's going to be campaigning with Kristen McDonald-Rivet, a state senator, who's running to replace Dan Kildee, who's retiring. So lots going on. Yesterday, we were with both of their Republican opponents, and they both campaigned with Steve Scalise and Richard Hudson. So we wanted to come to Michigan because you have these two House races, you have a big Senate race, and of course the presidential contest, all really coming down to the wire, all very close here. So it's an interesting place to sort of see where everyone is making their kind of final arguments in the last week here.
And if somebody was in Flint, as happens, what's the name of this barbecue restaurant? Because it sounds awesome.
Blackstone's Barbecue, I believe, is the name. I should have guaranteed that, but it is great. We've got a great vibe here. Yes, Blackstone Smokehouse. So from the few bites of my sandwich I've had, I can highly recommend. We're here for lunch. We've got a long day ahead and not sure what our dinner plans are. So we figured go hard on the midday meal.
Right. And I'm afraid that Danielle and I didn't tell you, Mel, that this is going to be one of our 5-hour podcasts. So I'm glad you got a couple bites in there because you're not going to see that sandwich for a long time.
Great. I'll just get up and run over and grab it.
So I look forward to editing your Michigan 7 and 8 story a little bit later, and that will be on rollcall.com and in Roll Call print. But again, those are open seats, as is the Senate race, and we're going to talk about, that's a plug, official plug for those of you listening to tune in to read Mel's story later on after it's published. But let's talk about Most Vulnerables. This is a long-standing feature in Roll Call where we write about who we see as the most vulnerable incumbents, and this does not include open seats because there is no incumbent in an open seat, obviously. Daniela, this cycle, the 2024 cycle, starting in 2023, you've been here for all the most vulnerables since coming on board. And what were your first impressions with like when you started and the challenges there, and now that we've wrapped up the most vulnerable incumbents feature for this election cycle, aside from just looking forward to not having to do one for another 6 months?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Certainly with the Senate list. I mean, when we think back, to the early days of this campaign cycle, we had folks like Joe Manchin in the mix, and Kristen Sinema, and Mitt Romney was, one of the ones we were looking at early on. Bob Menendez. These people are all, for varying reasons, different reasons, leaving the scene or have left the scene. So they're no longer in contention for most vulnerable. But certainly when we look at the Senate, when we started, we had two names that were at the top, maybe not in the very top position, but always very much in the mix. And that's Sherrod Brown in Ohio and John Tester in Montana. And that has not changed. The dynamics in that state, particularly in those two states, particularly in Montana, remains really tough for the Democratic incumbents. So that's been, one thing that with all the shifting and folks dropping out or opting not to run again or resigning from the Senate. In the case of Menendez, we've seen lots of different changes, but those two have been constant.
Yeah, and one sort of interesting thing about this list and how it's evolved over the last 2 years is that we usually do 10, and we've kind of struggled to find 10 vulnerable senators in this cycle. So we have 8 for this last go round. It's remained about then. It's been very difficult, especially once Joe Manchin announced his retirement, as you said, and Romney and so forth. That to find people who are vulnerable. And those dynamics, as you said, have not changed, with Tester and Sherrod Brown running for reelection for the first time, with Donald Trump at the top of the ticket in their states. So they have these uphill climbs. Tester's race is rated as tilt Republican, Brown's is toss up. And then we've seen this movement too, where in these sort of blue wall states, if you will, that we've seen the Democratic incumbents there, Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, Bob Casey in Pennsylvania, that those races are starting to they've started to move a little bit towards Republicans, although they seem to have stabilized in this sort of flux. Our friend Nathan Gonzalez has them as tilt Democratic, which is just this side of toss up.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think Wisconsin especially is interesting. This has been my first cycle covering congressional races for Wisconsin. And, last year talking to people who were gearing up and working on this Senate race, a lot of folks were like, this is going to be like a very, very competitive race. Yes, Tammy Baldwin won her last race by 11 points, but that is not going to be the case this year. And I was really surprised, into the summer, early fall, it really seemed like Baldwin still had a very sizable lead on her opponent, Eric Hovde, a Republican. And just in the last month and, kind of every week, that race has just gotten increasingly closer to just, it seems like a dead heat, real tie. So, it happened maybe a little bit later than I had expected in the cycle, but it's happening. And in Pennsylvania too, I mean, the race between Bob Casey and Dave McCormick is just so close at this point. It's really hard. And, a lot of the folks that we spoke with as we were compiling this list, I think that they kind of felt like it was kind of hard to, like, they're really on the same level, I guess is what I'm trying to say is, one is 3 and one is 4, right. But it's, any given day you get a different poll and the other could be different kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. And Jackie Rosen comes in at number 5, and she has been creating a little bit of distance between her Republican opponent, Sam Brown, and her, and to the point where the rating is now lean Democratic. So there is this sort of jumble, as you said, of like Brown in a little more vulnerable than Baldwin and Casey, but in any given day, it could be a little. They could switch places, it seems. Daniela, I felt like when we sent you to Nebraska and to Iowa to cover the races there, it almost like the dynamics in the Nebraska Senate race between independent Dan Osborne and Republican incumbent Deb Fischer almost changed like the moment you were booking your tickets and getting there almost in real time, where this was not necessarily on anybody's radar. Maybe it was on Dan Osborne's radar. But it just seemed like he's done nothing but pick up momentum in his race against Fisher. Talk about what it was like to be there, because now we have her at 7. We'll get to 6 and 8 also, but like because you were just there. I mean, what was that like covering that race, almost like as it evolved in real time?
It's really been fascinating to sort of watch this whole phenomenon take shape. Back in April, our friends at Inside Elections had a little sit down with Dan Osborne, and I sat in on that in the office, and you kind of came away with it thinking, wow, this guy is really interesting. He has some interesting things to say, but
No chance.
yeah, I mean, you hate to sort of make those kinds of judgments, but he's talking about how he's going to run without the strength of a party apparatus, formally behind him. We can get into what role Democrats may or may not be playing behind the scenes, or Democratic aligned groups may be playing. But in terms of having the strength of the party organization, that's a huge thing when you're taking on an incumbent senator. So it was kind of like, well, it's interesting. We'll watch and see. And I think the Republicans sort of just viewed him maybe as an annoyance or as somebody who's just, and then, weirdly enough, I mean, the guy's working very hard. He seems to be touching a nerve. He's trying to, Nebraska is a very, very conservative state once you get outside of Omaha in particular. And he is trying to tap into sort of these populist feelings that, he's trying to win over Trump supporters, basically. And we spent some time with him. Photographer Bill Clark and I went out into these very rural parts of the state, in the central and northern part of the state, very tiny communities. And
Nearly, I think, was one of your datelines.
Yes. Very, very far, hours away from Omaha, and fairly very rural. And it was, the reaction he got was interesting. There were definitely folks there who said they were open to his message. And one guy we spoke with, who's always voted Republican, hasn't voted for Democrat in years, decades really, said he was thinking about it. But one woman we spoke with, she's like, well, I like what he says, but then he starts talking about unions and raising the minimum wage and all this stuff. And that was like, that's socialism. I don't support that. So he's got a kind of a delicate line to walk in a place like Nebraska if he hopes to win. But we'll see. And I think there's been also, some discussion about the way Deb Fischer has run her race and how seriously she's taken him, and how active she's been and how out there she's been. So perhaps that plays into this as well.
Yeah. Number 6 is Ted Cruz, somewhat known entity in politics. Someone who's he's running for a third term. He ran for president. It seems like very few people don't have some kind of opinion about Ted Cruz in one way or the other. And this was a slowly developing race, I think, in terms of like its movement towards Democrats. It's still, Cruz is still favored. It's still listed as a lean Republican race with Inside Elections, but it seems like there have been enough polls that have shown Cruz's support a little soft, maybe a little under or at 50%, which is never a great spot for an incumbent. And Colin Allred, his Democratic opponent, who's in the House, has raised more money than the Federal Reserve, it seems, for this race.
Yeah. So, I mean, in some ways, we've seen this movie before, right? 2018, Ted Cruz, he's vulnerable. He's going to lose. And he didn't. Obviously, he won, not by a landslide or anything, but it doesn't matter. He's in the Senate. Democrats really do say this is different, though. That both a tribute to the campaign that Allred has run, and also that people in Texas, it's not so much about politics or policy, but more about just who Ted Cruz is. This ice storm that the state experienced a couple of years ago when Ted Cruz famously had traveled to Cancun, that was something that really stuck in a lot of folks' craw there. So that was something. And, Allred has painted him as a guy who's more interested in podcasting and sort of, expanding his own brand than really serving the people of the state. So, certainly competitive. We'll see if we get a similar result to 2018. But it's definitely become interesting over the past few weeks.
And rounding out the list is Rick Scott, who is still listed as likely Republican, but kind of just worth keeping an eye on. Florida has this abortion rights ballot initiative that could potentially swing some votes towards Democrats, towards former Rep. Debbie Muscarl-Powell. But sort of a long. This could have easily not been on the list in some ways, but like the fact that Scott has won 3 statewide elections by whiskers, and particularly after he's included this vast amount of his own wealth, I think it justifies him being on this spot.
Yeah, I think that this race is going to be interesting and maybe telling a little bit in a way of like how far right has Florida actually gone. 2 years ago, Ron DeSantis and Marco Rubio won their respective races with like huge margins. And there was a lot of talk about like Republican, Florida is just so far Republican now. And I think, this race is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, Scott famously never won any race statewide by more than like 1 percentage point, give or take. Like you said, the abortion referendum. Scott, kind of similarly to Cruz, has some of the same vulnerabilities on likability. You all we remember, our listeners probably remember when he was the NRSC chair and he put out a proposal that would have sunset all federal legislation after 5 years. He then had to walk back that would exclude Medicare, Social Security, the Navy, the branch of the armed services he served in. So, he has plenty of vulnerabilities for Democrats to attack on. But this is Florida. It's a red state. He's won several, big races here. And as you said, he has vast personal wealth. He's put a lot of his own money into this race and other races. So I think we'll see. Republicans certainly have an edge here in Florida just on registration numbers alone. So we'll see if I think no one is necessarily expecting a Marco Rubio margin win, but we'll see, how far over that, 1% number is he able to get, assuming Debbie Muscarl-Powell does not surprise us all and ride the abortion wave that we've seen other Democrats been able to ride in the last couple of years to a surprise win.
Right. All right, let's talk about the House. That's the 8 most vulnerable incumbent senators, and the House is like the inverse, of the Senate. I mean, we narrowed it down to 10. At one point, we were like talking a little bit as we were in the home stretch of this list, whether we needed to expand a little bit and cheat and do a double feature on one of them, and we decided to keep it at 10 because that's, it can get unwieldy. And then, if you make an exception there, do we just keep doing that? I'm glad that we did. I'm glad that we kept it to a top 10 list. It worked for David Letterman for years, right? Top 10. But, we could have put it, another 10 or 15 members on this list. And when you look at the list, it's headed up by Brandon Williams, who was also our most vulnerable incumbent in our last go round last month in September. His race has been shifted recently by Inside Elections to lean Democrat, but some of his folks, the campaign people in New York and in Washington, have said this is overstating his vulnerability. We're not seeing the same kind of numbers, but it's interesting. We are really locked in this weird situation, particularly with the so many members running for re-election who are either freshmen or recently come to Washington from New York, Hudson River Valley and Long Island and Orange County, California. We could have done just those a 10 from just those two parts of the map. But this again, we had to get 10 to this list, but we left off several people who are potentially vulnerable, like Jared Golden in Maine. There were folks who were saying like, Donald Trump is going to win this district, by a boatload of votes. His opponent is really good and in the state legislature and a NASCAR driver. I mean, let's talk a little bit about how we arrive at the list, because it gets stressful there at the end as we're trying to figure out, like, okay, how much more vulnerable is Marionette Miller Meeks than Bill Cartwright?
Yeah, I mean, I think I actually kind of thought that since we've done this so many times already, looking at these candidates, that this list might be easier. And I think in a way that there were sort of like fewer races that we were considering to be in the top 10, just because you have fewer races that are really obviously quite so clearly competitive. Like, you look at a race like Mike Lawler in New York, who was on this list earlier this year and last year, like, his race is competitive, but clearly not the most competitive at this point. But when you had those sort of, there's probably like 13 races, so not even quite top 15, but like 13 races that, like, those ones that we were leaving off, you can talk yourself into why one is more vulnerable than another. So it was very challenging to kind of come up and say, here are our 10 a week out. Things could still change in the next week. I think we can definitely see that. We can have a late October, early November surprise. But yeah, I mean, it's tough for sure.
Also, I want to correct issue an on-air correction. It is not Bill Cartwright from Pennsylvania. It is Matt Cartwright from Pennsylvania. He's a Democrat. He's from the Scranton area. Bill Cartwright, of course, is the former center for the Chicago Bulls. I don't know Matt Cartwright's basketball skills, but I'm guessing that Bill Cartwright probably has the edge there. So sorry to both Matt and Bill for mixing up the identities. However similar they may be in so many ways.
It's less than a week out. We're all
there's your sports metaphor, everybody. Yes. Yeah, I remember, Daniela, when we were, kind of getting to the end and editing the story, I mean, like the number of even groups that are aligned, like Republican groups or Republican aligned groups or Democratic groups or Democratic aligned groups, even they don't agree themselves who's the most vulnerable of these people. It's not like they're all getting together. So we hear one thing from the NRCC and one thing from the Congressional Leadership Fund. I mean, it's just like, it's kind of bewildering.
It is. And, everybody's kind of looking at the same set of polls and the same set of fundraising numbers. Those things are fixed. They don't change. But there's the dynamic on the ground that's really hard to measure. And that's something we try to take into consideration, where you just get a sense of what's going on and where people are at. And there's unique things, especially in House races that are so small compared with Senate or, obviously for president. These are really small. The districts are small, and local factors can really weigh heavily on how people are planning to vote for their representative, for their member of Congress. So those are all of the sort of calculations we make. But you're right; two people can look at the exact same data set. Fundraising numbers don't change, right? Those are fixed, but people view them differently, and everybody sort of has their own take, and that's what we're trying to sift through.
And I'm struck too that it seems that we can't even really have a general rule of thumb about ticket splitting anymore, because in some ways, like, we've seen that, like, Mike Lawler, for instance, in New York is, Mel, you wrote a story about this from New York, from on the ground, about how Lawler is not running away from being a Republican, even though he's in a district that would have voted for Biden by a lot in 2020, and will seemingly vote for Kamala Harris in the 2024 election. But he's in pretty good shape, and it seems like voters may be willing to split their tickets. And there's also a Senate race. Kirsten Gillibrand will likely win fairly easily. And then Lawler, might pull it out in a Biden district. And then, other swing district, Republicans and Democrats may not have that same kind of thing. So it's like, it's almost like voters have their own minds now. they're willing to tweak us and say like, no, I think we're going to vote not the way that you expect us to, which is, makes things very interesting.
And that's the test. I mean, that's what we're all going to be looking for on Tuesday night in a lot of these Senate races and House races is do people split their votes? Talking about some of these New York races, a lot of folks are looking at like, does Kamala Harris, how close to Biden's 2020 margin is she able to get? Obviously, she's had a much shorter presidential campaign in general. So like a lot of questions about like, will people vote for her? Do they know her well enough? That sort of thing. And like, how much close does that margin get? And how does that affect how many voters will split their tickets essentially? So a lot of questions about that in all of these races.
Yeah, for sure. And, I should note too, that there are 7 in this last bit on our last list of most vulnerable incumbents. There are 7 Republicans. There are 3 Democrats. And that is not a reflection that like Democrats are in better shape to retake the House. It really is sort of almost a preponderance of just how many vulnerable Republicans are in New York and California. We've got some perennials. Don Bacon, is always on this list. He's been on this list since he won his first election practically. But, it's really, interesting. And then I do want to note that Marinette Miller Meeks, from Iowa, is a new addition to this list, and this has less to do with the polling in the district as it is some of the factors on the ground. Danielle, do you want to talk about that, because you were in Iowa, for reporting on what's going on and the dynamics there, and why some of these why we're seeing her perhaps a little more vulnerable than using different yardsticks.
Yeah, and that's one where not everyone agreed with us, let's just say, on that selection. But certainly you look at the district. I think it's I think it was a
negative 3 for Biden. Biden
I-
would have lost it by 3 points.
Yeah.
In the
I was
current
trying to
configuration.
figure out it was less than 3 or more than 3. So, on if you're looking just on the metrics, she should be safer than even the neighboring district, which is focused on Des Moines. That was barely won by Biden. So that's very closely divided, but went, slightly the other way. So why is she more vulnerable? And again, those are some of those intangible factors we're looking at locally on the ground. The issue of abortion is very big in Iowa. It's not on the ballot, but as it is in so many states. But the state just in July, the very restrictive abortion measure took effect. So people are now, for the first time, facing that at the ballot box. And people have told us that Miller Meeks in particular is vulnerable on that and some other issues. So we take all that into consideration when we look at these things. She's running against the same opponent before. We're seeing that trend. You mentioned Nebraska. That's a repeat race as well. There's a bunch in California where the same folks are running against the incumbents. And, it's interesting to sort of wonder, will they do better this time? What's changed? You lost once against this person, but, what's changed? And in a lot of cases, 2 years makes a big difference.
It really does. And I think that, again, the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe versus Wade and the federal right to an abortion, it in some ways, it almost seems as if some of the shock is worn off, but the consequences have just become more clear about what's going on. Mel, you wrote a story with Sandia Rahman, using the Vice President Harris's speech in Houston last week on reproductive rights as a frame for this. And it's so many people, so many House races and strategists are framing this as, now that we've seen 2 years and what's happened, it's even more on some people's minds perhaps than right after the Supreme Court decision. And it's interesting. We frequently talk about liberals and conservatives. we may need to expand the palette of political orientation a little bit more, so it's like takes into account libertarians, who might more be aligned with Republicans on a lot of issues, but on abortion rights, like that's anathema to them to restrict that sort of access. So
Just to bring it full circle, I'm in Michigan 2 years ago. There was a big abortion referendum on the ballot here that really helped to drive Democratic turnout here. A lot of other factors, including the governor's race as well, but that was definitely a factor. And I remember talking to Alyssa Slotkin after her win last year, and she pointed to young voters in her district on that issue really being a part of her driving win. Republicans have tried to be more upfront about their stance on abortion this year. We've seen a lot of Republicans sort of talking about, I'm pro-life, but I support these exceptions. And then you've also seen Republicans like Mike Gunderson in California run a ad saying he's pro-choice. So you've really seen Republicans try to neutralize the issue in a way and just sort of be upfront and be able to kind of, or attempt to push back on some Democratic ads saying, oh, X Republican candidate is going to vote for an abortion ban. That's why you shouldn't vote for them. Seeing some of that in Michigan right now. So I think we'll have to see how much that issue still resonates, but it's hard to say it hasn't resonated since Dobbs.
Well, Mel, Daniela, thank you for talking about Most Vulnerables. Mel, we'll let you finish your delicious sounding sandwich. I hope it's not too cold.
Thank you.
We're gearing up now for Tuesday, for what could be an interesting, very interesting night. I mean, I'm very curious to see if like the New York races all go one way or the California races go one way, or because that would seem to indicate that one party or another is going to have a better night. If they're all split, who knows? It could be a while before we find out who's in charge of the House of Representatives in the coming Congress. But in the meantime, we'll do our pre-writes and get our we'll get our sleep in in the meantime. Thank you both for talking through this, and thank you out there for tuning into Political Theater. Check us out next week. We will be doing a podcast the 2 days after the election, making sure that we have as many things to talk about as possible, maybe even some results. Anyway, in the meantime, stay sane.